Commissioner, appearing as counsel for the Conservation Coalition. Gentlemen, when we left off from last Friday, we have been examining exhibit number 327, and I'll just ask the technician to pull that document up and place it before you. Perhaps we can just start with the first page, if you would, please, Mr. Lunn. This document is a briefing note, and the first page of which appears to be an action requirement. And there's a bit of a synopsis of the various steps that are taken before the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan is approved. Is that right, Mr. Grell?
Yeah, the briefing notes that the department produces go into a computerized system known as MEX, and I'm not sure what those acronyms stand for, but it's for tracking our briefing notes. And I believe the action request is generated by that system. So depending on where the note is in the system, you could have a different action request attached to it, depending on who's being asked to review or approve it.
My interest was drawn to the handwritten notations at the bottom of that page, and I showed you one of those on Friday. The first one appears to be 16 June, and my deciphering of the words, it appears to be signed by DM. That would be the Deputy Minister. Do I have that correct, Mr. Grell? 16 June. Signed by DM. That would be the Deputy Minister, would it not?
Yes, it could be.
All right. I realize this is probably not your handwriting, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm just trying to decipher, to the best of my ability, what these notations might mean. There's that says to MO for decision. MO would be Minister's Office. Is that fair?
That's a reasonable assumption.
All right. And then the one that I showed you on Friday at the bottom, well, first before we go there, there's a notation of 160609. Dan, please review. Scott. Do you know who Scott would be?
No, just to be clear, my involvement with these briefing notes is to get them through the RDG's approval in Vancouver. And I typically would not be involved in any of the sign-offs that occur in Ottawa.
Okay, so Scott, you don't know who the identity of a Scott would be?
In this case, I'm not sure.
And then on the 25th of June of 2009, the IFMP was approved with a note from the minister, and I showed you that note the last time we were here, and that was at page 5 of the document. There's a handwritten notation next to the minister's name, Ms. Shea, with the notation, need to ensure we maximize opportunities for commercial fisheries. Is it common for ministers to have these kinds of notations on a briefing note such as this, to your knowledge, Mr. Grell?
I have seen comments on briefing notes before.
Do you ever see comments on briefing notes on IFMP before, such as this?
There may have been, but I can't recall specifically.
Do you ever recall seeing comments from the minister's office that we need to ensure that we deal with conservation, or we need to ensure that we satisfy First Nations concerns? Do you ever see anything of that nature on briefing notes such as this?
I can't recall the nature of comments that have been on previous briefing notes.
All right, I'll leave it at that. Now, I'll turn to the issue of membership on the Pacific Salmon Commission, and as I understand it from discussions that we had with Mr. Lapointe, Canada is responsible for appointing members of the Fraser River Panel, the Fraser River Panel Technical Committee, the Canadian Caucus. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And with regard to the appointment process, my understanding is that my clients, the Marine Conservation Caucus, had been asking Canada for some time to be appointed to either the Fraser River Panel or the Fraser River Panel Technical Committee. Is that right, Mr. Rosenberger?
That's correct.
I'd ask that document 14 from the Conservation Coalition's documents be placed before the witnesses. This is a letter, it's DFO document, or Canada document 263866. It's a letter dated September 26, 2005 to the then Minister Jeff Regan. Were you aware of this document, Mr. Rosenberger?
I'm aware of 2 or 3 letters to ministers and the RDGs requesting participation in the Fraser panel or the Tech Committee. I did review this document when it was sent to me a couple of days ago.
Might this be marked as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit number 344.
I'm not going to take you through the document at length, but it appears to be from the first paragraph that the document is a formal request that Canada, through the minister, consider incorporating the participation of the Pacific Marine Conservation Caucus in the PSC. Does that accord with your understanding of the document as well?
Yes.
If we can now have document number 6 of the Conservation Coalition's documents, please. This appears to be an email which contains a letter dated July 18, 2007 to the then Regional Director General, Mr. Sprout. And if we can turn briefly to the last page of it, please. Under the CCs, it appears as though Mr. Grout, you were copied on this particular piece of correspondence, were you?
Looks like it.
If we go back now to the first page. Under the first paragraph makes a reference to a letter of July 6 offering observer status to the Marine Conservation Caucus Salmon Committee on the Fraser River panel of the Pacific Salmon Commission. Does that accord with your understanding of when the MCC was offered that opportunity, Mr. Rosenberger?
Yes, they've had observer status for 2 or 3 years in the panel.
And what is your understanding of observer status at the panel, at the Fraser River panel?
The way our Canadian, the way the panel works is that the panel members are those that are can raise questions or issues during the bilateral panel process. We do have observers that raise questions and issues at times. Within the Canadian caucus, we operate as everybody has an equal opportunity to raise their issues, debate them, discuss concerns, and provide recommendations.
As an observer, do the members of the MCC have any decision-making authority vested in them?
The decision-making authority of from Canada and through the panel is through the vote from the DFO member.
Might that be marked as the next exhibit, please?
345.
Mr. Lund, could you pull up document number 26 on the Conservation Coalition's book of documents, please? It appears to be a letter to Mr. Craig Orr of the Marine Conservation Caucus dated July 26, 2007. On the second page, under the signature, it appears to be signed by Mr. Paul Sprout as the RDG. And once again, it appears as though you received a copy of this piece of correspondence, Mr. Grout, did you?
Yes.
I just want to discuss with either one of you paragraph 3 on the first page. I find these words: I've also considered your requests regarding direct participation in the work of the Fraser River Panel Technical Committee. As you know, all 5 seats for Canada on the Technical Committee are currently filled. We are not presently considering changes to those representatives. And Mr. Sprout goes on to say, however, I'm sure there will be times when the MCC could assist the Technical Committee in their deliberations. To your knowledge, and this is a question for either one of you, does the MCC actually participate by assisting the Fraser River Panel Technical Committee in its deliberations and discussions?
I'm not aware of them participating in any direct technical committee sessions. I think at times they have provided input into the Canadian technical members who may bring that information forward into their deliberations.
Have either of you given any thought to whether you will directly invite the members of the MCC to be an active member as opposed to an observer status member of the Fraser River Panel or the Fraser River Panel Technical Committee?
There's been discussions about the membership of the panel and the tech committee at times, more towards the panel. There's a number of organizations and individuals requesting participation in the panel, and so we're considering that in any changes that might be made into the future.
Might this be marked as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit number 346.
Now, on Friday, we discussed a little bit about how the discussion process occurs with regard to the Integrated Harvest Management Committee and the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, Mr. Grout. And is it usual that members of the MCC submit correspondence or provide input into that process, into the IHPC process, by filing correspondence with you or your office?
Yeah, we would get correspondence from any of the participants in the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee process. We also encourage the representatives at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee to verbalize any submissions or concerns that they're raising at the meetings as well.
I'm going to show you a piece of correspondence for the 2009 Integrated Fisheries Management Plan. If I could ask Mr. Lund to pull up our document number 21, the coalition document number 21. This is a letter to the Marine Conservation Caucus, and if we can just look at the signature page just to get the context of who signs it. It appears to be a letter from Mr. Paul Ryle. I understand that he'll be coming later on to provide testimony to this commission, but I also note that you appear to be copied on this piece of correspondence. Is that right, Mr. Grout?
That's correct.
Are you familiar with the contents of this particular letter?
Yes.
Did you draft it?
I may have had a role in assisting with drafting portions of the letter.
I want to go through some of these subject areas. This is what I'm going to call a response to the Marine Conservation Caucus with regard to the 2009 IFMP, a response from DFO to some of the suggestions made by the caucus. Is that correct?
This letter, as I understand it, was provided as a follow-up to a meeting we had to discuss the Integrated Fishery Management Plan.
Under the heading on the first page, if we can just go back to page 1, please. I don't know whether you have hard copies with you or not, so if you want to take some time, we can go through the whole letter, but I'm going to go through specific topics. Under the heading Wild Salmon Policy, WSP Implementation, there's a response from DFO, and I'm going to suggest to you that the Marine Conservation Caucus has always tried to suggest to the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee and as part of the IFMP that there will be a direct implementation of the WSP into the context of the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan. They've been very persistent in trying to get that moving forward. Isn't that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of the points that are raised regularly by the Marine Conservation Caucus.
And if we look at page 2, for example, of this particular document, The italicized portion at the top of the page, I would suggest to you, is a recommendation coming directly from the MCC to DFO with respect to the 2009 Integrated Fisheries Management Plan. And recommendation 1 specifies that all salmon CUs should be identified with whatever information on status is available. We've discussed, and I'm not going to go into at length with you with respect to the CUs and the wild salmon policy, but it's my understanding that CUs are in the process of being identified pursuant to the wild salmon policy for Fraser River sockeye. Is that correct?
Yes.
And there's approximately to 35 or something in that range, 35, anywhere between 32 and 35 conservation units which have been identified that correspond to Fraser River sockeye. Is that fair?
There has been ongoing discussions about the specific number of CUs for Fraser River sockeye at a science meeting this fall, working on developing some of the benchmarks to assess the status of Fraser sockeye. There was a discussion, this was at our Center for Science Advice Pacific meetings in the fall. There was discussion about whether some of the CUs should be identified as such.
So would you agree with me then that it's a topic that's somewhat in transition at this point in terms of the finite number of CUs?
Yes.
And that's something that Canada has been working on?
Yeah, we've been progressing from identifying the initial lists of CUs to moving to develop methods, standardized methods that might be used to assess status for those. And then following up now with more specific work of trying to apply those methods. And the meeting I referred to this fall was trying to do that, apply some of these methods to Fraser sockeye.
And the reason why I'm focusing on the wild salmon policy and conservation units in the context of your evidence is that when I review a document such as the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan for 2009, I see very little in the way of references to conservation units, or very little in the way of wild salmon policy. Is it because we're still at the seminal stage of developing that policy? It's not yet ready for rollout?
I don't know if I'd characterize it that way. I'd say there's been an iterative process of development of the tools that we would use to assess the status of conservation units. We've moved from identification of a preliminary list of conservation units to paper by Kerry Holt and others to try and identify methodologies that could be used to assess status. And now we're moving into a phase of specific papers that might be applying some of those methods to identify status for some of these populations.
Are you referring to the paper by Dr. Sue Grant that attempts to place benchmarks, lower benchmarks onto some of the conservation units for the Fraser River sockeye?
Yes, that's correct.
And are you aware of that paper in her work that shows that there's somewhere, and I know the paper's in transition, but at least preliminarily, there's something in the range of 7 conservation units for Fraser River sockeye, which are actually in the red zone, according to the initial description that she afforded to it in her paper. Isn't that right?
Well, the paper was reviewed this fall, and it's my understanding that revisions have been requested prior to finalizing the paper.
Yes, I understand that. But if you read the paper, you would agree with me that there are 7 conservation units which are demarked in that particular paper as being within the red zone, correct?
I can't recall the specific number.
Now, the reason I'm going on this at length is just that if you've got somewhere in the range of 30, 35 conservation units that you've now identified, and I think you've already identified that you've got 19 stock management groups for Fraser River sockeye, is that right?
We have 19 stocks. I wouldn't characterize them as management groups necessarily, but stocks for which we have longer time series of spawner and recruitment data, which allows us to use those populations in our forecasting methods and assessment in the Fraser sockeye spawning initiative process and modeling work.
Okay, so that gets entered in. So you've got 19 sets of data that can be entered into the Frizzy model. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then we've heard evidence from Mr. Lapointe, amongst others, that you, for the purposes of the Pacific Salmon Commission, you've got these 4 management aggregate groups. Is that right?
Yes.
Right, and I think there were early steward, the early summer, and the late run. And so I guess my conundrum and the problem that I'm going to suggest that you have is trying to distill down from these conservation units, these 30, 35 conservation units, into managing just 4 runs or 4 aggregates. And how do you do that? How is it possible to do that in a meaningful way where you actually are going to be looking after the conservation units that are most in trouble?
Well, we do it through a number of ways. So one of the ones is in looking at the Fraser Sockeye Spawning Initiative work, we're assessing the impact of various different harvest rules on the component populations in the management group to look at, for example, probabilities that the spawning abundance of those populations falls below specific benchmark levels. While we have 4 management units for the Fraser River panel purposes, Canada has also managed at a finer scale resolution on some occasions. Cultus Lake sockeye is an example. We've also applied additional management constraints to protect weaker populations. For example, in the early summer run in 2010, we looked at extending a window closure that we had in place and also putting an additional constraint on exploitation rates. So even though we've got 4 management groups identified, we have managed at finer levels in the past.
Would you agree with me to this extent, that if you're taking these aggregate management groups, that in order to manage effectively to preserve biodiversity and the conservation unit status, that you have to manage to the most vulnerable conservation unit in that mixed fishery? Would you agree with that?
It's certainly a suggestion that has been made by some. Currently, we're looking at developing harvest rules for the major management units that are consistent with preserving the component populations.
By that, when you say the component population, do you mean the conservation unit, or what do you mean?
Well, as I pointed out earlier, the Fraser Sockeye Spawning Initiative model is using the data for the 19 stocks for which we have longer time series of spawn and recruit data. Some of those 19 stocks represent more than one conservation unit, and some conservation units don't fit within some of those stocks. But for the 19 where we have the data, we're looking at developing a harvest rule approach that looks at the probabilities of exceeding or falling below spawning escapement benchmarks for each of those populations in the model. So in some cases they represent CUs, in some cases they represent more than one CU, and in others a CU may not be directly reflected by one of the 19 stocks.
And I understand we'll be getting into the Frizzy model later on and evidence, so I'm not going to go into detail with respect to the Frizzy model with you, but my question is more of a general one about Frizzy. Have there been attempts, or are there attempts to your knowledge, Mr. Grout and Mr. Rosenberger, to incorporate the conservation unit and what we know about conservation units into the workings of the Frizzy model?
Well, for populations where the 19 stocks represent the conservation units, those are clearly included in the model. There's some CUs that are not directly reflected by those 19 stocks, and that has posed a challenge for trying to incorporate into the model itself. This is a model that relies on time series of spawn and recruitment data for its operation.
Going back to this document, Mr. Grout and Mr. Rosenberger, the recommendation 2, I want to just make sure I understand some of this. The recommendation 2 in the italicized portion of this letter says, use the 75P cumulative probability forecast for planning 2009 fisheries. Now, when you were leading your evidence of the IFMP for 2009, I understood that the early run, the early Stewart run, certainly used the 75P in terms of its plan. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The MCC is recommending that the 75P be used not just for that early Stewart, but also for the summer, the late summer runs as well. Is that correct?
That's my understanding of what the recommendation was, yes.
And why wasn't that recommendation followed with respect to the 2009 IFMP?
Well, the suggestion that the 75P forecast be used is essentially that that reflects in 2009 a more conservative, if you will, forecast level. So there's only a 1 in 4 chance that the returns would be returning at less than that level based on the forecast distribution, or a 3 in 4 chance of something larger than that. The use of the 75P had been used in some cases in the past. It is an arbitrary selection of a particular forecast level that might be used. And one of the key points that we made at the time was that we're really focusing on our in-season information to assess the run size of these various different populations. And we didn't feel at the time that it was appropriate to set everything at 75P.
The last part of this letter that I want to examine with you is recommendation 4 on the next page. Continue to manage timing aggregate overlap explicitly. Do not, in caps, use a 10-10 rule. And then it offers an explanation of the 10-10 rule, where fisheries can proceed if co-migrating aggregates are less than 10% of the total abundance and less than 10% of the smaller aggregate is exposed to the fishery. Does, to your knowledge, DFO use the 10-10 rule in managing fisheries for Fraser River sockeye?
It has been used in the past. There's various discussions about options to be used when there's an overlapping stock that's has a small tack or no tack at the time, when there's a larger, more abundant overlapping population co-migrating with it. So it's looking at ways, either within the same species and sometimes across species. So it's looking at rules that we would use to try to protect those smaller migrating populations when they co-migrate with either another species or a larger stock grouping.
The recommendation goes on to say, this approach intentionally fishes beyond tack, total allowable catch, and into escapement and or First Nations FSC fish. Do you agree with that proposition that they're putting to you there, Mr. Rosenberger?
Not in that terminology. It does mean that you're looking to fish beyond the tack, and so it's what you're looking at ways to try to minimize that impact. Often the reason that we're looking to do this is for the purposes of having FSC fisheries.
Mr. Commissioner, might this be marked as the next exhibit in these proceedings, please?
Exhibit number 347.
If I can ask document number 34 from the Conservation Coalition documents to be pulled up, please. Gentlemen, what you should have before you is a paper entitled A Rolling Discussion Paper on the Implementations of Pacific Fisheries Reform Beyond the Fraser Mixed Stock Fishery, Exploring Options for Voluntary Implementation. Are either one of you familiar with this paper?
I've seen pieces of this paper in the past and participated in some discussions which I understand were related to some of the ideas that put forward in the paper.
It appears to be that this particular copy, which is a Canada document, has a draft date of June 29, 2007. You could just scroll down just a wee bit there, Mr. Lund. So I wanted to discuss, not at length, because I think that we're going to be discussing some of these other topics later on, but I want to get your information or your evidence with respect to some of the suggestions that are being made in this particular paper. The first one is an allocation transfer policy. Has DFO given any consideration to actually going to an allocation transfer policy?
We currently have a allocation transfer program in place. I'm not certain if it's defined as a policy, whereby we are purchasing up commercial licenses from marine mixed stock fishing areas, and one objective out of those licenses is to reassign them into more terminal areas to try to reduce mixed stock fisheries.
Maybe I could add to that as well. The current allocation policy for salmon contemplates transfers of allocations between the existing commercial area gear types, but does not specify how that might work between commercial fleets. And by those I mean the licensed fleets in area A through H. It doesn't contemplate how the transfers might work between those fleets to inland areas, for example.
One of the other topics, and I'm looking now at page 3 of this particular paper, that is being promoted at the bottom of the page under the bold heading, Trading Immediate Benefits to First Nations for Compensation to the Commercial Sector Through New Conservation-Based Arrangement, and in brackets, conservation credits. Has DFO had any response, formal or otherwise, to this particular suggestion?
I can't recall if we've responded to the conservation credit notion specifically as it's laid out in this report. In reviewing this document over the weekend, I might confirm my recollection that the specific mechanisms weren't particularly laid out here. It was more of a concept for how something might work.
All right, I believe that, to be fair to my clients, it was just put out as to engender discussion, and my question would then be, what kind of discussion has centered on these kinds of suggestions that are being made?
Well, I guess in terms of one of the ideas, if I understand it correctly, is that harvest could be moved out of the main stem of the Fraser River, where there's mixed stock fisheries occurring, and be focused in more terminal areas. And in this case, the Harrison River was an example of one of the spots where that might occur. Certainly with the demonstration fisheries the department has implemented, we have looked at providing commercial access for a demonstration fishery in the Harrison River, which would have removed harvests that might otherwise have occurred in the Fraser main stem itself. So it's not inconsistent with some of the ideas that the department's explored through its demonstration fisheries.
Might that paper be marked as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit 348.
I want to finish with a discussion of the Marine Stewardship Council's work. Your council showed you a 3-volume set, which are the public records, and I was going to ask that 343A be brought up. That should be volume 2. While we're waiting for that, my understanding of your evidence from last Friday was that the certification report showed that the Fraser River sockeye was sustainable within the terminology of the Marine Stewardship Council. Is that right? Is that basically the gist of your evidence?
That's correct.
Now, if I look at this particular volume and I go to page 224, my understanding is that the certification was conditional on a number of things, a number of conditions being met. Is that right, Mr. Grau?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. A number of conditions were identified for each of the 4 sockeye fisheries, and those would have to be addressed within a 5-year time frame, is my understanding.
Right. And part of the conditions were that DFO would actually have a management plan of things that it would have to deliver upon in order to make the certification process go beyond the 5 years. Is that right?
I'm not sure that I understand your question. The department has put together an action plan to address the conditions that are laid out in the report. Is that what you were asking?
Yes. Okay. I think that's probably a better way of saying it. And what appears to me under Appendix 6 of Volume 2 is the department's action plan to address the conditions for marine stewardship certification of the sockeye fishery in Fraser River. Is that right?
Sorry, I missed the last part of your statement.
Well, I'm just simply asking you whether this appears to be the DFO action plan that was submitted in conjunction with the MSC certification process.
You mind scrolling down a few pages there for me, please? Yes, that looks like it.
And for example, on the page that we're now looking at, which should be page 225, and if we could just highlight just briefly the unit and deliverable table there that shows on the bottom of that page. Under the unit Fraser, that would apply to the Fraser River sockeye, would it not, Mr. Grau?
That's correct.
And under the lead, where it says FAM, that would be the branch of DFO.
Yes, Fisheries and Aquaculture Management in Vancouver.
And the timeline, there's some discrete timelines of deliverables that are itemized there.
Right, those are the planned dates when that item would be addressed.
If we could now look at page 228, maybe just scroll slowly through so Mr. Grau can see what's being discussed. Do you have a hard copy there, Mr. Grau, or you're relying upon this electronic version?
I do, but I haven't flipped to the specific page.
This table appears to go on for a few pages, and then at page 228, under the heading Conditions Relating to Implementing DFO's Wild Salmon Policy, there appears to be that the MSC certification was very much tied into implementation of the Wild Salmon Policy. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And in this particular case, there's a number of Strategy 1 items that DFO said it would do as part of the certification process. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
I'm not going to go through any of these at length, Mr. Commissioner. I'm simply going here because my learned friends opened the door by tendering this document. I wanted to ensure that the certification process was seen that it was done, but with conditions. If we can continue to scroll down through some of these conditions, there's a table there. And I just wonder if you can highlight that table, Mr. Lunn, and just amplify it. Thank you. There's a number of timelines there, and under the action, identification of conservation units, and under the timeline, there's a paper reviewed and approved by PSARC. That's the whole Holtby paper I think you were talking about, was it? The Holt and Holtby paper?
No, I did refer to several papers earlier. That was one of the ones I referred to as identifying the conservation units for Pacific salmon.
Right. The third action item, define LRPs. Now that refers to limit reference points for each target stock CUs. Now, I'm not going to quibble about LRPs and lower benchmarks with you, but basically, as you understand it, DFO is in the process of defining lower benchmarks for many of the conservation units for Fraser River sockeye. Is that correct?
That's correct. That was the purpose of the paper that was through our science review process this past fall.
And then the last action item is define TRPs. What does TRP stand for?
In this case, it's referring to target reference points.
And would that correspond roughly to the upper benchmark for CUs that the WSP identifies?
It might be more appropriate to ask some of these questions to Paul Ryle. He's been our lead for the MSC process, but certainly the work to assess status of conservation units for Fraser sockeye refers to upper and lower benchmarks. The limit reference points and target reference points may or may not refer to those specific points, or they may refer to the specific management reference points outlined by the management decision rules.
Thank you, gentlemen. Those are my questions.
Welcome.
Thank you. The next council will be for Area D Salmon Gill Net Association and Area B Harvest Committee. Mr. Rosenblum.
Don Rosenblum, I appear for Area B, Sainer, Area D, Gillnet. I thank both you gentlemen in anticipation of you answering my questions. Mr. Commissioner, before I commence my cross-examination, I wish to indicate that I've had a healthy exchange of emails with Ms. Baker throughout last week and into the weekend, because Ms. Baker, quite appropriately, is asking Council to calculate the amount of time necessary for cross-examination. I fully respect the reasons why that's asked. During last week, prior to the testimony being tendered by these two witnesses, I informed Ms. Baker that I anticipated maybe a 40-minute cross-examination. Again, this being a calculation prior to the Friday testimony. After the Friday testimony, of which I was present for part of it and not for the latter portion of it, I communicated with Ms. Baker and informed her during the weekend that I would be of a time frame significantly greater than 40 minutes. I would estimate now approximately an hour and 10, an hour and 15 minutes. I have informed Ms. Baker generally that that was the direction that was going. I apologize to the Commission, but quite frankly, I don't think it really needs much of an apology, because we are being asked to calculate time for cross-examination before the testimony is given by the witnesses, and so it's obviously a matter of some skill to anticipate what the time frame would be. Having said that, I will do my best to keep my cross-examination as efficiently delivered as possible. Gentlemen, I first want to deal with a point that was made by Mr. Leadham in his cross-examination this morning, his first item, and that related to the Minister's approval of the IFMP for 2010, I believe, and it is exhibit number 327, if I have that correctly, and Ms. Baker will inform me otherwise. And Mr. Leadham put the document before you, and on page 5 of that document, he drew to your attention the entry by the Minister at her asterisk next to her signature, which reads in part, "Need to ensure we maximize opportunities for commercial fisheries." And so your attention was drawn to that. I have questions for you regarding that entry. Can you inform me, as DFO officials, what meaning you put on the ministerial entry in that IFMP that you are, quote, "you need to ensure we maximize opportunities for commercial fisheries"? How would that be interpreted by your office?
Well, my interpretation of this comment was that that would be something that we would try and do consistent with the guidelines that are laid out in the IFMP.
Well, that being the case, wouldn't it be redundant for the Minister to be making that entry if all she's asking is that you comply with ministerial policy? Would she be putting in that document, make sure you do comply with policy? Is that all she's saying there, by your interpretation?
Well, I guess in response to that, the Minister did not speak with me directly about this comment, and I didn't receive additional direction for changes to be made by the RDG in the Pacific region, so I was giving you my assessment of what that comment meant.
I appreciate that. Mr. Rosenberger, do you have any response to my question as to how the Pacific region interpreted the ministerial direction as found in that asterisk entry?
No, I don't, and I wasn't aware of that comment until I became involved in this process.
And you say until you got involved in this process? I'm sorry, would you just run by me the time frame of your...
I don't normally get back these documents. It's something that comes back to region. And so, although I knew that the plan was approved, these handwritten comments I wasn't aware of.
All right. Well, you are now aware of them, and my question to you is, how do you interpret the political directive as found on page 5?
Similar to Jeff, there's no specific actions to change any parts of the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan that was put forward, so I didn't see any specific changes that we would make because of this comment.
Would you not agree with me that the minister is stating in very clear terms that the department must be very, very careful in weighing its decisions to ensure that socioeconomic issues are considered by the department in managing the fishery?
That is part of the decision process that we go through. It is trying to take into account social, economic, cultural, the biological, and so it's consistent with how we're managing our fisheries.
I see. So you say that, from your vantage point, the department has effectively been weighing the socioeconomic impacts of its decision-making in harvest management. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
Okay, I'll come back to that a little further on in my cross-examination. I want to now ask you a few questions regarding Cultus Lake. With respect to the 2009 Cultus Lake run, I believe you, Mr. Rosenberger, and I can refer you to transcript at any point, if, as I cross-examine you, you wish to review the transcript of last day or your earlier testimony, I'm very happy to refer you to it. I just want to speed things up, and unless it's absolutely necessary. You spoke about the 2009 run of Cultus Lake as being reasonably, these aren't your words, but that they, well, these are your words, definitely exceeded people's expectations. And 2010 was quite satisfactory also. My question to you is this: can you and DFO inform us as to the breakdown or ratio of the returning sockeye of Cultus Lake that are hatchery fish as opposed to non-hatchery fish?
The vast majority is enhanced fish. It's a combination of, it's mostly from the, what we would refer to as sort of the normal hatchery operations as opposed to the captive brood fish. But the significant majority of the fish are enhanced as opposed to wild fish.
And you can say that with some certainty, can you not, sir, because the hatchery fish are fin clipped for identification purposes?
That's correct.
Do you see any significant consequence to the fact that the majority of the returning fish are hatchery fish as opposed to lake fish?
Our science people have taken a look at that. There's a new Cultus recovery strategy document that was put through our Center of Science Excellence last June. Because of some of the concerns around the captive brood fish, lack of those fish returning to spawn successfully, we're not seeing those fish in the process. We're looking to discontinue the captive brood side of it. We are not looking at this stage to discontinue the hatchery portion, egg take and fry release side of things, largely because those fish are from wild fish that we're taking. So that what we're trying to do is remove the majority of the wild fish that come back to the fence, because it is a smaller part of the total. And those are the fish we're using in our hatchery program at this stage. So we are monitoring it. We are concerned that, we'd like to have more wild fish. We'd like to have more wild, successful natural spawners. But at this point, we're removing many of them from the ability to naturally spawn because we don't want to have hatchery fish going through our system, like taking fish for the hatchery again that we know are from hatchery original origin.
Mm-hmm. Knowing a little bit of where we go from here with this inquiry, with this hearing, and with the schedule, is there someone that comes to your mind that will be testifying that maybe of a scientific background that would more appropriately be able to answer the significance of the fact that most of the returning Cultus Lake fish are hatchery fish?
Dr. Bradford, I believe, will be here at some time, and he is the lead of the cultist program.
Mr. Commissioner, I think that's correct, and there in the section which is identified on the hearings plan as Wild Salmon Policy Part 2, there will be a whole section dealing with the cultist recovery planning and recovery efforts, so that may be where this topic could be dealt with in more depth.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to further matters relating to cultists. And I'm speaking of the appropriate management response to the cultist situation. And you speak of the SEP, the enhancement program, and the recovery program, ending with the involvement of the CSAB. What does CSAB stand for?
Commercial Salmon Advisory Board.
Thank you. With the Fraser Valley First Nations and finding common ground. I'm informed of the following, and I wish to put this to you, and I wish you to confirm these are in fact the facts in respect to the Cultus Lake Enhancement Program, and I've put this to previous witnesses. In 2006 was when the CSAB negotiated a higher harvest rate on lates, that is cultus, in return for contributing money to address habitat issues. The DFO wasn't. That is, DFO had only implemented harvest management, catch reduction in their rebuilding strategy. In 2006, the CSAB caught approximately 100,000 fish with the proceeds for the sale earmarked for the pike minnow program, milfoil removal, and fed fry. That was from, now, firstly, do you agree generally with that history back in 2006? Either of you?
You have more knowledge than that, or?
That's my general understanding. I think you indicated that the department wasn't contemplating any. Maybe you could repeat what you said about what the department's actions were at that time.
Well, what were the department's actions at that time? Was it not that the department's response to this problem at Cultus Lake was this initiative with CSAB wherein 100,000 fish would be caught and the proceeds would go into a program? Is that not correct? And I'm going to come to the LaRocque decision in a moment, but just stick there.
Well,
freeze frame 2006.
My understanding of some of the discussions that occurred at the time was that the department was considering a number of potential recovery activities with salmon enhancement program as part of that, but some of the discussion was around whether additional monies might increase the size of the enhancement component of the program, in addition to some other activities like pike minnow removal.
Well, are you suggesting that in 2006 the DFO response was intended to be more, in terms of the enhancement issue, more than simply this program with CSAB and the monies that would be generated from that catch?
My recollection is that the department had contemplated some activities, including some of the hatchery activities, and one of the things that was of interest was expanding the number of expanding the size of the facilities at the hatcheries to increase the number of hatchery fish that could be released.
Okay, so you say contemplated a program beyond simply what I've stated here. Let's go on. Because of the LaRocque decision, and I'm not sitting in this hearing every day, I'm not sure if the LaRocque decision has been canvassed exhaustively to the point where the commissioner understands its consequences, but assuming that to be the case, would you agree with me, because of the LaRocque decision, DFO refused to take the money from the CSAB as it had come from the harvest of fish, hence the salmon table came into being, and its funds the annual pike minnow removal as well as the contribution to the annual Father's Day recreational pike minnow derby. Do you agree generally with that?
I can't speak to the sequence of events, but I do know the department did not accept funding from the CSAB for the purposes of expanding the hatchery, for example.
And the salmon table and its membership is regarded as a different entity. It's a joint industry native entity. Would you agree with that?
I'm not an expert on the terms of reference for the salmon table, but I do know those various groups have participated at times at that table.
Okay. And how do you react to this statement that my clients inform me, and that is that the end point is that DFO won't or hasn't spent money on habitat issues where industry stepped up to the plate. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think the department had been contemplating a number of different activities, and the industry funding was intended to augment or increase some of those. I am aware of habitat work that we have done in terms of assessing groundwater in the Lindell Beach and other areas around Cultus Lake. So a number of these activities have been done by the department.
Well, I'm going back to the recesses of my brain here because this is testimony given before Christmas. But I believe that Ms. Stahlberg testified that there'd never been, and please, I stand corrected if I mislead this inquiry about this, but that she testified there'd never been a habitat assessment analysis done of Cultus by DFO to the best of her knowledge. Would you agree with that testimony?
I don't have a basis for either confirming or denying that, to be honest.
Well, but being in the position you're in, Mr. Grout, if indeed there had been a habitat assessment analysis done by DFO, you'd be aware of it, wouldn't you?
Well, I do get a lot of things crossing my email on my desk. I don't recall seeing that one in particular.
Right. Mr. Rosenberger, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think that habitat assessment is part of the recovery, Cultus recovery teamwork. So that was led by DFO and raised a number of these issues. In looking at habitat work there, your statement that DFO wasn't doing anything else in the regular habitat duties of people looking to do developments, logging, whatever might be going on in the area is part of the ongoing operations of the department. Specific extra activities around pike mineral removal or milfoil or other aspects like that might have been the focus of that discussion.
Well, let me ask you this quite bluntly. As you stand here testifying, are both of you satisfied with DFO's initiatives on salmon enhancement in the Cultus area in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, certainly the performance of those activities has been recently reviewed, and a number of them appear to be effective. I will say we have looked at doing some things that have not appeared to be effective. For example, the milfoil removal, and we've not pursued doing some of that work.
And shouldn't it be done? Isn't it obvious that it should be done?
Well, the evidence that has been reviewed suggests that that's not an effective way to assist the recovery of Cultus Lake.
Okay. Well, from the beginning with this hearing, we have heard about Cultus as being obviously a focal point of concern because the Cossawick listing and so on and so forth. Are you both saying that to the best of your knowledge, DFO has responded appropriately and completely in dealing with enhancement issues at Cultus? Is that your testimony?
Well, I would say the department has put forward considerable resources into assisting the recovery of Cultus Lake sockeye. If your question is whether more resources might have enabled additional or other things to be done, I think that's certainly possible.
Just possible, but not necessary in your opinion?
From my side of it, I would say that at this point...
Sorry, I just want to finish. I apologize with Mr. Grout. I think you were about to respond.
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
You said possible, and I said, and not necessary? You said possibly more could be done, and I'm saying to you possibly or necessary that it be done.
Well, I use the word possibly because there may be additional activities that haven't already been identified, but I couldn't comment on which specific things those might be.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Rosenberger.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment that the actions we've taken in line with some of your earlier questions about the proportion of enhanced fish to non-enhanced fish returning to Cultus system is a significant factor in trying to maintain the wild population or making sure that the enhancement does not somehow alter that unduly alter the relationship in the system. And so the captive brood stock was an action which is fairly extreme and rarely taken in British Columbia. to try to deal with issues when we were concerned about potential extinction. Now we're concerned about BKD, bacterial kidney disease, being present, but also that those fish are not successfully either spawning or surviving after they're released. So there's in enhancement, often as we're working our way through different enhancement techniques, we need to take a trial and error process and try to understand the relationships to the results. And and we don't, for sockeye enhancement, we don't have a long history in this province, and we don't have necessarily know all the right techniques. So I think that the method and the rate that they have gone forward with the enhancement process in Cultus is appropriate from the information that I've seen today. On the milfoil question that you asked, what we've learned in dealing with milfoil is that when you have a plant and a small piece of it gets ripped or torn, which is what happens when you're trying to pull these things out by the roots or using a mechanical device, is that literally down to potentially a very few cells or a single cell will grow a whole new plant. So in the areas where we've been trying to do the milfoil work, we've actually generated many, many more plants. So it's actually working against the objective that we strive for of trying to hand or mechanically remove them. They are looking at, and this has happened in the Okanagan and the Shuswap system as well. So the concerns now are that the only effective way in trying to deal with milfoil is large blanket mats or other devices that stop the photosynthesis or whatever the process is. And I'm definitely not an expert, Dr. Bradford or others. But at this stage, unless you understand all those relationships, moving forward with some of these techniques, just as fast as you can be more of a problem than it could be solving. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do in Cultus, is learn as we adapt as we make these efforts.
Well, without belaboring the issue, then is it your testimony this commission should not be concerned with Ms. Stahlberg's evidence that there has never been a enhancement analysis report done on Cultus? That should not concern us?
I think that's not my testimony. Your question, and I think what both Jeff and I said, is we're not aware of Ms. Stahlberg's testimony or on whether or not there had been a full habitat assessment. Now you're talking about an enhancement assessment, and my comments back were that the Cultus recovery team, which has been in play, has looked at a large number of issues, and they looked at groundwater, they looked at forestry, looked at a lot of things. They narrowed that scope down to a number of issues they thought should get more attention, and which is what the actions that they're working through now. And there was a report done on the success of some of those actions in June of '09, which is guiding us in moving forward.
Yes, and indeed, Ms. Stahlberg's evidence, to the best of my memory, was about habitat analysis, not enhancement analysis. So asking my question again, in the context of Ms. Stahlberg's evidence before this proceeding, that there has not been a habitat analysis done of Cultus, should that be of concern?
And I can't comment. I wasn't here when she gave a reply.
Right.
What I've stated is that I think that there was work done in the recovery team, and that Dr. Bradford would be a person that you could get more information from.
Thank you, I'll do that. Moving on, if I may, in terms of the IFMP, you have testified previously that it, of course, needs ministerial approval. I want to direct a series of questions to you regarding decisions made in season where you wish changes to the IFMP. Do those decisions require ministerial approval if you are deviating from the letter of the IFMP?
In 2010, when we wanted to make a change to Cultus, we thought that was significant enough that we wanted to make sure that we had the minister's concurrence. As I mentioned in my testimony in '09, where we wanted to consider options for having limited incidental harvest of sockeye or some small fisheries in potentially some terminal areas from First Nations. The plan that we took, I briefed to the RDG, and I assume, because I have no knowledge, that he briefed Ottawa, and he may or may not have had ministerial authority, but we did have some small fisheries that they were aware of, others in Ottawa, whether the minister was or not. So in that case, there was not, to my knowledge, a a sign-off from the minister.
So do I hear you to say that some decisions in terms of deviating from the IFMP require ministerial approval and some don't?
Well, that's two examples that we have, and what we try to do, I believe, on any significant issue is to have that concurrence from the minister.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Would you repeat that again? It's advisable to have the concurrence, is that what you said?
Essentially, yes.
Yes. Is it not somewhat cumbersome, overly cumbersome, to require ministerial approval for some of these mid-season decisions of deviation from the IFMP when it's summertime, ministers are on vacation, Ottawa's basically vacated? Is that causing a problem in terms of flexibility where there are decisions that you, Mr. Rosenberger, or people in your position want to make but are hamstrung by the fact that there isn't easy access to the minister?
It's clear that, and correct, that we do want to make some relatively quick decisions, that information changes often in a very short period of time, day or two. I'm not aware of a case where we've wanted to have decisions or ministerial engagement that we haven't been able to have that, but it's a very short time frame, and that could be the case.
So it's your edition you're in where you are instrumental in directing changes to the IFMP, that you are never hampered or restricted in your flexibility to do so because of a communications problem with Ottawa and ministerial approval. Is that your testimony?
We didn't have any problems in trying to make the change in the cultus in 2010.
Yes, and so generally you're saying that that has not been an issue. There, in your opinion, is not a cumbersome schematic for changes in the IFMP when necessary. You don't feel restricted.
I wasn't in 2010, but I could imagine some circumstances where you could be. So I think it's worth taking a look at how the wording is in the IFMP. That is part of the reviews that we do annually. And the 2009 change was one that we had discussions and changed how the wording occurred for 2010, for example, so we wouldn't be in that kind of a position again.
All right. Well, this is interesting and intriguing where you say it could be worthwhile in looking into this. This is precisely the kind of thing this commission is presumably struck to deal with, is to make life easier for everybody and to bring about a more effective fishery. Do you have recommendations that you would make here that might be of assistance to the commissioner in refining the lines of communication to ensure that mid-season decisions are implemented without any unnecessary restrictive process that might be time-consuming and might lose the fishery?
I don't have anything that I would like to put forward right now.
There isn't. You have no advice?
Not at this point. I think if I was going to provide that kind of a recommendation, I would want to be thinking about that and consider some of the different processes. But I don't think it would be appropriate for me to just provide advice off the cuff. I think there's a lot of related places where these processes link together, and I think we need to understand how that all links.
Yes. I regret I can't remember. Do you come back here to this hearing? Are you scheduled to be a witness further on?
He's coming back and dealing with the Aboriginal fishing interest.
Just the Aboriginal,
sure.
yes.
I don't know if he's coming back again for anything else.
Well, if your testimony goes on till tomorrow, and if you think about it overnight, you sit in a very valuable position here, Mr. Rosenberger. Unlike the rest of us, you are on the front line. You are making these decisions. You effectively made some decisions in 2010 that are much appreciated by my clients, and that they speak very well of you in terms of your intervention when we saw what happened in 2010. Because you sit in this critical position, any advice that you have for the commission, I invite you to speak up. If not now, even if your cross-examination goes into tomorrow and you wish to add something, I would welcome you doing it, even though I won't be the one cross-examining you at that point. So I leave it at that. Mr. Grout, do you have anything to say on this, or is it more Mr. Rosenberger's area of concern?
Well, the only point I might add is to the extent that we can capture the various different scenarios that may occur in any given season in our integrated fishery management plans prior to the season, we're well served where we can do that.
Thank you very much. I don't know if this is the time for the break. Thank you.
We'll now recess for 15 minutes.